Welcome to today's panel, today at Samhain in Virtual Circle Sanctuary. I'm Reverend Minerva Duggan, and I'm here to moderate the panel on death, dying, and bereavement in a socially distanced world. This is our panel where our experts are going to discuss the changing ways in which we are grieving, in which we are celebrating losses of our loved ones, and honoring our dying and our dead. Because we've had to change how we grieve in this distanced world, we'll discuss some tools that we can use to manage our grief during these times. This panel discussion is pre-recorded. If you have questions or comments, however, you can put them in the comment section of the thread, which we will be monitoring on the day that this is aired, on Samhain Day. So you'll get your questions answered. With that, I'd like the panelists to introduce themselves. Reverend Sharon, would you introduce yourself and tell us about your experience?
Sure. I am Sharon Stewart, Reverend Moonfeather. I am from Brooklyn, Wisconsin. I am a certified death midwife. I've been doing that for over a decade. I am also a longtime hospice volunteer, and I train our hospice volunteers and some of our staff. I have a lifetime passion about end of life. I am a certified end of life specialist, and I also work with the bereavement at our hospice program. And I'm also certified as a No One Dies Alone volunteer. Pretty much anything that has to do with end of life is my passion. Thanks for having me here today.
Thank you. Tereesa, would you introduce yourself?
I'd be happy to. I'm Tereesa Daul. I'm from Deep Here, Wisconsin, Green Bay area. I am also a death midwife trained by the wonderful Sharon, my mentor, and I am a hospice CNA. So I spend all of my working hours working with people who are in need of help with their daily activities, bathings, spending time with families. That's my full day every day, and it is really a passion for me, and I love every minute of it.
Thanks, Tereesa. Welcome. And Dana Basch, would you introduce yourself, please?
Yes. Hi, I'm Dana, and I am an LPC, and I'm a psychotherapist in private practice, as well as a community grief specialist for Agrace Hospice here in Madison. And in private practice, one of my main focuses is grief. But for me, grief has been almost a lifelong experience. My father died when I was 10. So for me, helping people through grief and just educating myself on grief to help other people is something that's very important to me, and has also allowed me to have more perspective in processing my own grief. So thank you for having me.
Thanks for being here. This panel is well experienced and educated, and I'm excited to see what we talk about today. So the first question that was submitted to us was whether any of you have noticed or seen any differences in grieving with the pandemic from COVID-19. And Dana, would you start us off with that?
Sure. Yes. This is a really great question, and such an obvious question in our times right now. And the answer to this is most definitely COVID-19 has created a loss of so many other things other than the death. So a loss of rituals being a big thing, no regular funerals or ways to be with your person as they're dying and after they're dying, and the gathering of friends and family and community. So much loss around that, which just, when we have a loss, multiple losses can intensify the grief. So the person dying and then not having a way to honor and express grief and sadness in our normal ways is just making it way more complicated and way more just painful. And we worry that, in the wake of COVID, that we will see a lot of people experiencing grief in a more complicated way. You know, sort of COVID related grief is going to be the new pandemic
Wow.
years down the road. So it's very, and then people have to grieve alone after too. You know, people are
Sure.
not coming over, people are not filling their space with their love and their presence and their casseroles. It's, you know, so then they grieve alone, and they don't have the same resources like in-person grief groups, in-person counseling. All of these things are part of their support system. So most definitely.
Wow, those are some good points. It sounds like we'll have to be dealing not just with the grief of the loss of the item, the person, the event, but also the grief for the grief process.
Yes. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Very complicated with all of this.
Wow. Tereesa, have you seen any differences?
Excuse me. Absolutely. Again, I am working with people when they are in the process of dying. So I am working with those families and those patients in situations where the pre-death grief is being interrupted. A lot of our patients are in facilities, long-term healthcare facilities are under lockdown. They're not able to have visits, or even when they're actively dying, visits may open up a bit, but it's extremely limited. We have our own very small facility, which is designed for those particular patients, and even actively dying, it's 2 patients or 2 visitors in a room at a time. So the people are kind of congregating outside and at least able to talk with each other and talk through some of that, but the limitations on being able to go through that healthy process as someone is passing, having those conversations with their loved ones, spending the time with them is being taken away. And we're seeing definite impact both with our patients and with our families due to those situations. It's very difficult to be that cut off at such an important time.
Thanks. Sharon, how about you? Do you have anything to add to this?
I just have just a little bit to add because Dana and Tereesa really covered a lot of it. In my death midwife practice, you know, right now with hospice, we're not allowed to even go into the facilities and volunteer or go into people's homes. So people that are, you know, having experiencing the death of their loved one aren't getting the support through that they normally would, even through our hospice programs, because we're not allowed to go into the homes or into the facilities. So that is a huge loss, I feel, for people as they're trying to deal with the death and grief. The other thing, like with Tereesa, I also see it ahead of time, and I'm with the families. I usually walk with the families ahead of time and during that death and after that death for a while. And that's just been a really hard thing to do. And so I really feel that we're already in a state of grief over what's going on in our society with this pandemic, and we're not knowing how to deal with that. And then you add on the death of a loved one, and that's another level of grief and a new thing to try and figure out in this pandemic time that is really causing people to struggle. You know, they're already at their limit with the pandemic, and now you add on this stress of this death that they can't handle normally like they would have in the past. I agree with Dana that the level of grief that we're going to be dealing with on down the months and years to follow this pandemic is going to be huge, because we're grieving not having the support that we usually had in grieving on top of everything
Absolutely.
else.
Well, to follow up on that, do any of you have any suggestions on how we might handle that lack of chance to grieve, or that delayed grief, or any way that we can help our loved ones or friends if they're grieving? Does anything come to mind for anybody?
I think just acknowledging it. I think that's one of the important things is recognizing this is hard for you. You don't get to grieve in the way that you should and need to, and just being there for them. And, you know, this is not a problem that can be solved. So we just have to, it's important to just acknowledge the difficulty, acknowledge their reality, and get creative in terms of, you know, if there are things that you can do to support them, and remember the person.
Thank you.
I'd like
Anybody
to add
else
to
have
that I'd like
Sure.
to add to that if I could, please, Minerva. I think, you know, this is something that I have always taught, but I think that this is a really good tool to have in your toolbox right now, is to offer concrete things, things that you can commit to, things that you can do for the person that's grieving.
Yes.
For instance, don't just get on Facebook and say, I'm sorry about your loss. Take the time to send that card with a personal note in it. Take the time to pick up the telephone and call them. Do concrete things. Don't, you know, like Dana mentioned before, that we're missing people bringing over the casseroles. Well, there's still other things that, in that, there is great comfort in that. There still are things that you can do in that avenue. Yes, we're not making dishes to pass to send to someone's house, but you could still do door drops of, you know, even more of the necessities, cases of water, some soda, you know, toilet paper, even things like that that they just need in their home. Do something concrete. Make that telephone call and offer to do something. I'm going to the grocery store. Is there something I could pick up and drop on your porch for you? You know, offer to do concrete things is so important during this time, in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. The specific things like dog walking. I'm taking my dog out for a walk. Can I come pick up your dog? And, you know, one of the things people say is, let me know if you need anything. And that's not helpful for a person who's grieving, because they often can't identify what they need, and it's hard for them to ask. So if you do deliberate things like Sharon said, you know, acknowledge dates, big and small, birthdays, death anniversaries, Valentine's Day, or any other dates within that person's experience and culture that might be important to them. Acknowledge them, and do be very deliberate for them, and even just being with them, you know, at a distance right now, obviously. And it's okay to be awkward. It's okay to say, I don't know what I'm supposed to do for you right now, but I'm going to make you something and you can put it in your freezer. And yeah.
Thanks. I think we forget that awkward's okay in these times.
It is. We are so
don't need to be
afraid.
perfect.
Yeah, we're so afraid to say the wrong thing. But sometimes saying, I don't know what to say, but I'm just here for you, is the best thing you can say.
Exactly. And I think that it was awkward. A lot of society was awkward about dealing with death in the first place before the pandemic ever even came along. And so now we're all awkward about it, you know, trying to find our new ways. And so I agree with Dana in that. Don't be afraid to say, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to say, but I want you to know that I'm here for you. And just things like that, and move on with those concrete things.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I'm actually quite hopeful in a weird way that this pandemic may actually help people with learning to interact when there is death involved, because you can't be doing the large gatherings. You can't be doing the usual things. So therefore, picking up the phone, writing that card, those things, hopefully, maybe some habit will come out of that and people will be able to carry that forward.
Yeah. To just sort of speak on a very concrete example of that, Tereesa, we had a neighbor down the street, two neighbors, and the husband died during the pandemic of a heart attack. And so I would, you know, because it was the pandemic and we were home, we saw the ambulance there, you know, and then we noticed that he wasn't out as much. So we sent a card, and then I see the woman all the time when I'm on my dog walk, and I always say, can I take your dog for a walk? And she always declines, but I always offer, you know, and I don't know if that would have happened outside of COVID times. It might have, because we would have noticed eventually that he wasn't out mowing his lawn and manicuring it perfectly. But because of this, it has made us be like, we need to be more aware of the people around us and take care of them.
Well, those are all good points. Thank you. The next question that we have is, have any of you, and we kind of alluded to it before, but have any of you seen any grieving around events or happenings other than deaths? Has any of that come across your screen? Sharon, have you noticed?
Oh, definitely. I mean, even myself personally, let alone, friends and family, what you're seeing, loss of events. I'm looking at here coming up with right now with Samhain, not being able to get together with your community and your tribe. So the loss of events for our church, the closure of our churches. The other things is, for me as a parent and grandparent is I'm not getting to go to grandparents' day at school or go into their sporting events. We're not going to have Thanksgiving this year. And that's my main holiday, for my family to come home. And so I'm grieving the loss of that. There pretty much any event or anniversaries and birthdays for people that have been very serious about this quarantine during this pandemic. Everybody has experienced loss with that, and are feeling the anger and the frustration, and which are all a part of grief over losing all of these things that have been taken from us.
Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, to remember, grief is a response to any loss. We talk about death specifically, but that grief is the response to anything. So it's like every day where we've lost something, we've lost the ability to do lots of things, and it's hard. It's the ability to be able to do something like this in person,
right,
and connect with all of you. Yeah.
I've heard some people say, well, it's just the loss of an event, and I feel like I can't be upset about it. I've heard people say this, but right, it's especially if those things are important to them, and in a time like this, everything becomes important.
Yeah.
Well, and it's
Absolutely.
even grieving that healing touch from people.
Oh
Yes.
People want hugs. People want to hold their hands for the most part. Not everybody, but most people need that to thrive. They need that human touch, that human connection. And we're grieving the loss of that big time.
Yeah.
Yes.
I've had experiences with people who experienced a loss prior to COVID. And because of COVID, their plans for memorials and, year anniversary dates of deaths have been, sidetracked because, they were going to go do something somewhere to honor the death of a person who died way before COVID. And that marker in time has been disrupted. So they can't even do what they needed to do. And so their memorial or their trip to some place to scatter ashes has been postponed indefinitely. So it's like, it just keeps piling on.
Wow. So how do you all think we should address the lack of closure that results from grieving for events, not being able to grieve in our typical ways, and not having that process during the pandemic?
Well, I can say I actually have
she has some pages.
pages of ideas about this. But
good.
To begin with, when it comes to personal loss and lack of closure, for me, my brother passed away unexpectedly this summer. And for reasons we'll probably get into later about do you or don't you go to a funeral, I opted not to. So the phone calls were one thing, but it was actually physically seeing that obituary, physically still making a trip to the cemetery, doing those types of things that help bring that into focus and put it front and center. My Ancestor Altar, I would suggest make use of it. Mine is up year round. You probably can't see it, it's behind me, but it's a year round thing. So as I lose a beloved person and they cross that veil, something goes on that altar, whether it's their obituary, it's a memento of them, it's a picture of them. It helps me to witness that this has happened, accept it as fact, and then gives me the opportunity to communicate with them and reflect on it, reflect on their life, reflect on what they've meant to me, So it helps bring that at least more realistic, if that makes sense, when you can't get in person to attend those services and do those things and see that body or whatever you need to do to help bring that around to you. And we've already talked about the phone calls. That's a part of it. Keep those phone calls going. Check in with people if you need help. Those things are going to help you out quite a bit. And then there's odd little other things. And I'm just going to put it out there, video games. And before you think that that's kind of off the wall, for those of you who are gamers, I'm going to talk about two games. One you'll know probably very well, and one you may not. One is Animal Crossing New Horizons. I have seen some amazing things being done on these islands. I have seen memorials made to people, who have died in the pandemic, just as a generalization, or other disastrous events. I have seen Latinos making amazing displays to honor Day of the Dead. I myself have a little virtual ancestor altar, and when I lose someone, not only do they go on this altar, a flower goes there. So every day, whether I do something with my altar or not, I'm doing something in game to just stop and remember that those people have gone, and this is something that I'm dealing with and processing. My entire island looks like a virtual pagan spirit gathering. If you would go through it, I have a spiral labyrinth, I have ritual space. I have a cemetery right now with a carriage in it that looks like something Sharon set up for Samhain, because you have to go through it before you go to the ritual. Those little things help me, at least, because I'm a horrible solitaire practitioner. And it's still something that I'm seeing things that are important to me regarding my faith every time that I open that game. And then the other one that may not be as familiar is called Spiritfarer. It's a new game. It's available on multiple platforms, and the entire premise of the game is your character is taking over for the ferryman, and it is your job to help fulfill final requests of spirits so they can pass through the Everdoor to the other side. And it's not all doom and gloom. There's things like farming and scavenging and side quests and things you're doing. You're going to other islands, you're meeting other spirits. You're feeding them daily, you're taking care of them, but the ultimate goal is to help them to process what they need to process so they can journey on. And your character often knows these people. They may be relatives of theirs, they may be friends, and there's every age group from small child to elderly, and all different things that go about in their process as they're getting ready to journey to the other side. And then you are finally faced with that moment when they say, I'm ready to go. And you escort them and you watch them take their final steps and go into the other world. I found it personally extremely cathartic. You feel those emotions, you connect to those characters, you see your own relatives sometimes in those characters, and you have to let them go when the time comes to let them go. They can't until you take them. So there is that sense of release and that sense of letting go and accepting that this is inevitable. This game just faces death, and it's kind of amazing.
Wow.
Very
Would you
cool.
tell us the name again, please?
Yeah.
Spiritfarer. Spirit,
Farer.
F-A-R-E-R, one word.
What was the first one you said, Tereesa?
Animal Crossing New Horizons. It's
Okay.
kind of a virtual sim island. You create your own thing. You bring in animal villagers, which is why it's called Animal Crossing. Even my villagers are totally pagan. I have hippie and somebody who's Norse. I have a guardian on my island. I mean, I have a comedic. Yeah. So
That's
anybody
wonderful.
who's really into that game, it's a great way to help work through those things that we feel like we've lost. And my husband's retired. He
Great.
can't go anywhere. He doesn't do anything other than maybe shopping. So it's like his whole world. It's his world. So.
And
That's
the
great.
thing that
Fantastic.
and the thing I get from this, it sounds so much like a process, because I think one of the things is, when we talk about closure, like that you will always grieve this person in a way, and there's no right or wrong way, the grief can be you know, sort of like this one day and like this one day.
Yes.
But, you know, it sounds like there's some of these things that are steps to be helpful to get to another part of this journey. But I think it's important for people to know that, you know, closure or next step or, you know, your journey with this is going to look different. And if you don't necessarily have closure in a way that you identify with, that's not abnormal. You know, it's okay that this is something that is, I mean, because it's permanent. They're gone. You know, they're not coming back. It's
Right.
not a problem to be solved, but it's, but like you explained, Tereesa, there are different ways to, hi Spartacus.
Sorry.
There are different ways for different people to sort of acknowledge different sort of rituals and steps. And that can be really helpful, especially when we don't have these other in-person rituals. But Tereesa, these are so cool. Thank you for sharing.
My pleasure.
Yeah, and I love that too, Tereesa. Thank you. I mean, for the people that do gaming, I could see where that could really be so helpful and healing. I just want to mention a couple things that I have, you know, helped people with during this pandemic that seems to have been working for some of the people, is encouraging the people who are grieving to get back into some sort of practice that they've thought didn't have time for or forgot about. Maybe it's daily meditation or yoga or exercise or going for a walk, whatever, scrapbooking, whatever it is that brings you some joy, and to get back into a practice. That's been helpful for people that haven't been able to have a normal grieving period here. Another thing that I have suggested to people that seems to be working well is writing or journaling, getting back into that and just keeping track. I've actually found some, and I'm sorry, I should have looked it up before this, but there's some great journals you can find online, and where people can write down their daily thoughts, and it kind of takes them through a process, you know. And so that's just having the griever write about what they're feeling to help them move through this grieving process on their own. And the other thing is for the person who's trying to support that griever, is to hone up your listening skills, become the best listener that you can become, and give that person a call. And remember, you know, this grief process isn't about you, it's about them. So we're not telling our stories on grief or our experiences on grief. We want to hear where they are at and respond to where they're at in their grief process. So becoming a good listener and picking up that telephone and sharing stories about the object of the grief, whether it's, you know, the loss of a job during this pandemic, or it is the loss of a loved one or the loss of a pet, whatever it may be. Sharing stories, giving the person that's grieving the opportunity to tell their stories has been very healing during this time, in my experience.
Yeah, absolutely. Sort of saying the person's name, acknowledging, you know, saying, oh gosh, you know, I remember when so-and-so used to make this meal. I'm going to make that tonight in their honor, you know. And, you know, one of the things just that you touched on, Sharon, just in terms of doing things and getting back into something, people sometimes are hesitant because they think when you're sort of offering these as tools that you're trying to offer something to replace the grief, like that you're trying to get them to forget, and that's not it at all. Like, the grief will be there forever, the loss will be there forever. What we're trying to do is to figure out how to be with the grief. And some, you know, these things like scrapbooking, getting outside, movement, taking a shower. I know that seems really little, but taking a shower, brushing your teeth, sweeping the floor. Like, if these things could make you feel a little bit more sort of put together or organized or better for even a second, that can mean the world to a person. So it's not do this so you'll forget. It's do this so you can be with it, because it's not going away.
Yeah, and acknowledge those little seconds. Acknowledge that, you know what, I just sat down and watched a TV show without thinking about, you know, my partner who has died. Or
Yeah.
I just went to the grocery store alone, which we always did that together.
Right.
Acknowledging those little pieces where you made it through that grief, whether it's
Yes.
a moment, an hour, a day, they'll start growing, but acknowledge your accomplishment in that grief.
Yeah. Yeah.
That all makes excuse me, perfect sense. Just a real quick question, Sharon. Are those journals you referred to online, if someone searches under grief journal, do you think they'll find what you're suggesting? Or is it just a regular journal?
You know, I wish I could remember what I searched.
Well, maybe if you would put it, do a Facebook post later today or at some point in the group, that would be helpful. Thank
Yes.
you. All right, so excuse me. Our next question, and I'm going to skip around a little bit. How would you suggest people go about deciding whether or not to go to a funeral? There are still some funerals that are in person, although smaller. Do you have any advice on how to approach that in regards to their personal grief and grieving with family or friends? I hope that made sense.
I would start with have the conversations. If you can in advance, if you know that a death is expected. For instance, my mother-in-law, we've been expecting a phone call for years at this point. So recently my husband and I had the conversation, in the event that mom passes, what do we do about me? My brother, as I said, passed away unexpectedly this summer. I made it my decision not to attend the funeral. My other siblings did. I had to do what was right for me. Again, I'm working with hospice patients. I am in the community every single day. I'm already putting myself and them at risk, and I didn't feel that it was responsible of me to go across the state, stopping wherever I'm stopping, attending a public function, and adding to that risk. That was my choice. So, and the family, of course, my family was very supportive of that and understood. But if you can have those discussions in advance, even if you're not expecting a death, what do we want to do in the event? And then really focus on what weigh the risks for yourself, but also where your grieving process is. Do you feel that your grieving process can withstand not going, or do you feel that it really is important for you to be there to see those people, to go through that experience? Everyone has to make their own personal choice on what's best, but you know, those are my suggestions, is really just talk it through. Don't jump to a conclusion, see what's going to be best.
Thanks. I think people worry about feeling or being seen as selfish or uncaring. I've heard that from some folks.
Wow.
Does anybody else have thoughts on how to address that?
I just think, to echo what Tereesa said, you need to pay attention to your personal safety as well as others, and sort of weighing all of the options and the risks, and you get to decide ultimately. And and there will be, if you choose not to go, recognizing, well, there will be some emotional sort of fallout for you with that. You will be missing something from being there, but that doesn't make it the wrong decision. It's really just what you think is best. And if you can't be there, can somebody video you in so you can be part of it? But I think we all have to think about our personal safety, as like Tereesa said, that are we a person who could be exposing others to risk? So that is, Teresa's decision was the peak of not selfishness by protecting others, and people don't think about that. I think we have to think about ourselves and others, and we don't want to create more loss within this.
Good point.
I think also too, you have to also think outside of the pandemic. There are still, for instance, elderly parents who have children who die before them, who live states away, that can't travel to the funeral. They need to make that heartbreaking decision on, can I go to my child's funeral states away, I'm not healthy enough to travel. I mean, I've dealt with that in my own family and with other people, you know, so it's not just during this pandemic. And I think the thing to remember is, you know, grief doesn't start and stop with the funeral. Right. Grief is a process that's going to go on for months. And so you still have opportunities to process that grief beyond the funeral. And the other point is that you can also record the funeral. And my sister died on the East Coast and my mom wasn't healthy enough to travel. We recorded the funeral for her and we just brought it back and played it for her. And we sat there as a family. Wow. You know, which you can do now in the pandemic if it's your, you know, your safe pot of people. And we watched the video at home and we got to process the grief with our mother in a real personal setting. And it ended up really beautiful, quite frankly. So it's not just the pandemic. I think it also is like what Tereesa says, you need to have these conversations. You know, we need to get comfortable talking about death. And if that, like we said at the beginning of this, if that's something this pandemic does is gets us comfortable using the words death and dying and being more comfortable and making more decisions, I would be grateful for that. But I'm kind of getting off on a tangent there. I'm sorry about that. But just
it's
remember,
a useful
it's not
tangent.
just during the
It
pandemic.
is.
And one thing, Sharon, that you said that made me think of something that I think can be really helpful for people too, is when you talked about videotaping it and bringing it home to your mom. It was your mom, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So one thing that, like in groups that I've done with people, one thing that's come up a lot is that people wish they would have recorded the funeral so they could revisit it when they were ready. Because a lot of people, especially depending on the death, like this, I've heard this a lot from people who've had a child die, that they don't remember anything. Exactly. Because they were in such, you know, I mean, to have a child, to have anybody die, but a child die, they don't remember anything. And they wish somebody would have recorded it. And it can be sort of one of those weird things. Why would you record a funeral during non-pandemic times? You know, but it's okay. You know, record the funeral. You don't have to watch it ever if you don't want to. But if you have it and you get down the road and you think, I really need to see that, then you have it. So have somebody record the funeral. And
yeah, that's really important. You know, an expected death versus an unexpected death. The I don't even know, the remote control you go into after a death and, you know, planning that funeral and going through those days. Most people are in a daze and they don't even remember any of that. Right. So to have the gift of that funeral, I mean, I remember when my brother died, you know, weeks later reading like the guest book sign in, and it's like, I don't even remember seeing that person. Yeah. They were there. And I, you know, so having that to help process the grief, I could see as a huge benefit.
Yeah, absolutely.
Those are good points. Thank you. Do you have, excuse me, any other suggestions on how to handle distance funerals and distance grieving? Are there any other thoughts that you'd like to address for the audience? We've talked about journaling. We've talked about recording.
Yeah, I was going to say Zoom. Zoom funerals are a thing. I've helped several families do Zoom funerals. Parking lot funerals. Churches around here are doing funerals in the parking lot. There are some funeral homes that are doing drive-by viewings with the body outside the funeral home. There was recently in our area the wake was held at home on the family farm. The funeral home bought the body there so it could be all outside open air and people could go by. You know, it's adjusting to what works for you, or what you need, and you know, what you have the tools and people to be able to safely carry off during this time.
Thank you. All right, to move on. Sometimes we don't know when somebody is grieving or what they're grieving. We've kind of talked about this a little bit, but have any of you noticed any signs, whether they're age-old signs of grief or something new because of the pandemic, but anything we can look for in addition to the more active listening that we've talked about? Does anything come to mind?
Well, I think they're kind of two questions or maybe two situations here. If you know somebody has had a death you can pretty much assume that they're grieving, probably for the rest of their
Yes.
lives.
Right.
It will just look different, over time. And so with those people in your life, they might be sort of isolating themselves and things like that. But I think it's okay to assume they're grieving no matter what, if they've had a loss. And but then what was the other part of your question, Diane? I felt like there were two parts to this.
If we don't know that somebody's grieving, are there any signs that we can watch for?
Yeah. Like if you don't know if they had a death or if they've had something happen.
Right. And to follow that with the loss of events and life as we knew it, there's a grief in that too. I was just wondering if there's anything that you're seeing short of the standard crying, wailing, remembering, if anything's coming to mind for anybody.
Yeah, I think that's a really hard question to sort of be specifically answered.
Sure.
Just because, at least for me, as a practitioner, because usually when people come to me, they're coming to me because they're grieving, and I know that ahead of time. And so I don't take any of their outward symptoms or anything as unusual. But people who, I think sometimes if you notice somebody is sort of showing symptoms that concern you or something, if they're withdrawn or not engaging, I think in any case, if somebody in our life was doing that, we would want to sort of extend a hand or a Zoom or something to them. But I think just if they've lost somebody, assume they're grieving and support them in some of the ways that Sharon had talked about, dropping things off, things like that. But just know that some people may not, in their grief, it may not be in their nature to share, or not be in their nature to say, I'm grieving or I'm sad. They might just be doing it in their own way. So, but that's a hard question to answer for me. I don't know about Tereesa and Sharon.
It is a hard question, and if you talk about outside the, what you might see with someone normally grieving, but I would like to touch on, someone grieving that loss of community versus a death, the loss of community or the loss of going to events or something like that. I've said this many times is Facebook can be a great tool to spy on whoever you want to spy on. So if you notice on Facebook that someone is putting up a bunch of negative posts, or they're posting something that they don't normally do, or they're not on, normally they post 10 times a day and they haven't been on for a day or two, to keep an eye on just those subtle little things like that, on what their Facebook posts are. How many times have you seen someone post, I'm not okay today? And so what do? You get underneath and you make a comment. Well, again, I'm telling you, do more than that. Pick up the telephone, make a call, send a private message, do something than just that comment or emoji in the chat. Reach out to people when you see someone not, acting abnormal or not on Facebook. Do that phone call and reach out and check and make sure that they're okay. And you don't have to call them and say, are you okay? Because people are always going to say, yeah, I'm okay. Just reach out and say, hey, I noticed you haven't been on Facebook, or I was thinking about you today, so I just wanted to check in and say hi, and open up that door to communication and good listening.
And actually, sorry, Tereesa, go ahead.
That's okay. I was just going to piggyback Sharon's exactly, because I actually have people on Facebook that I stalk just for that particular thing. Are they online today? Have they been online in the last couple days? And yes, it's not the how are it's just a general friendly text that is open-ended, so they will respond to, but not specifically to say, or just pick up and call. A lot of things like that, I don't even respond on the Facebook page. It's I can't believe my cat died. This is what I found. I pick up the phone and call. I don't even bother with Facebook. At that point, I want to be talking to them personally.
Sure.
And one of my favorite things to ask people, you know, sort of Sharon, you said, you know, don't ask them if they're okay or how they are, because you know that that's not going to get anywhere. Because how can you really answer that? Do you really want to know how I'm doing? You know, but what I usually say to people is, how is today? And then that sort of, you know, can bring them into the moment. Today, I don't feel great. And then they don't have to sort of like, it's not such a loaded question and sort of like this thing that becomes unanswerable. And also the thing that, you know, when people say, how are you doing? Oh, I'm fine. You know, that's what we do. So how is today? That can sometimes be a really great question to ask people because it's open-ended and it can narrow their response.
It's a good
One
idea.
thing that I started during this pandemic, and I admit as this pandemic gets longer, I haven't been quite as good at it as I was in the beginning of the pandemic. But, you know, when you notice someone is struggling and, you know, even when you try, maybe you've tried to do that call and you're still not getting much of a response. A tool that I found that was really helpful was I sent them a video, you know, through the text, a video text. And I just let them know that, hey, I'm thinking about you today. And I just want you to know how much I value your friendship. And this is what I love about you. And, you know, make it the best day you can. And I can't tell you how the response was for that was. And when the pandemic first started, I would just take my phone and I'd scroll. And wherever it landed, that's who I sent a video text message to that day. And I did that for months. And it meant so much to people because we don't know. There's a lot of hidden grief. There's a lot of people that are just on that edge and just having just that message and knowing someone out there cares. So do random act of kindness during this time.
Sharon, can I get into your contacts, please? I want that. I just love that, Sharon. I just think I think that's such a great way. Yeah. Thank you for doing that for the people in your life. Cause that's really amazing.
Well, and it's good for me too. It helps us both, you know, it helps you through.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
It kind of goes back to that whole thing of you never know what anybody else is going through. You never know what someone else's experiences are. And I think this is a great time to reacquaint ourselves with, like you said, those random acts of kindness. The whole, I'll pay for that guy's coffee behind me when you're at Starbucks or whatever. That was a thing for a while, and then it seemed to have dropped off. And I think it's those little things, like you said, that just random acts of kindness can really go a long way, whether people are, well, everybody's struggling right now, but whether someone is going through the grief of a loved one who's died or the grief of losing an experience or whatever it may be, everybody is struggling right now. So those little things go a long way, I think.
Right. Thank you. Do any of you have any suggestions on self-care during grief in general or during this weirdness that is the pandemic? Video games, Tereesa, that makes good sense.
Just simply take time, whatever that time looks like for you. If that time is video games, if it's knitting, if it's binge watching TV with popcorn, whatever it is, make that downtime. Everything is so much more complicated and so much more difficult than it was a year ago at this time. And I just think it's even more critical than ever that you take that time for yourself. You can't do everything. You can't be everybody for everyone else. You also need to just focus on what are those things that you can do, because part of this whole loss is also probably those, as we've talked about, those activities you're used to doing. I'm used to going to a yoga class. Well, take the time, watch a YouTube video, do yoga with the YouTube instructor, whatever it might be, just to have you time.
Thank you.
Well, and I found
Sharon?
for me is that, you know, I think we all, when the pandemic started, we all started tearing our houses apart and sorting through this and sorting through that. And there was a sense of accomplishment in that for me, to know that, oh my goodness, I got the closet that I've been wanting to get cleaned out. And, and that led to, okay, let's move to this room and let's move to that room. And what I found, was just watching the little things on how I personally was handling this, realizing that other people are probably, feeling something close or near to. And for me, I realized that I need to have this sense of accomplishment, to get things finished and done and organized, to lift my spirits up. So you got to figure out what it is that lifts you up and is going to make you feel good. Like for me, I know I need to make lists and have a list to cross off so that I feel like I've done something today. And I can remember, when Dana said something about, just taking a shower today. I can remember times in my life when I was grieving the loss of a job from an injury, and I would make a list, take a shower, take a meds, wash my hair. If that's all I could muster that day, I wasn't making a list that was not attainable, wasn't reachable. It was simple things. So wherever you're at, know what your list is, and don't be pie in the sky with it. Be, mindful that I can do this, because if you can make yourself feel a little bit better, just that little bit, like we were talking about, that moment during this time, the better for you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Dana, do you have any thoughts?
I do, and I have just a small list that when I work with people, I have this worksheet, dog hair. I have this worksheet that I give to them that I'd be willing to share with anybody. There's an author, her name is Megan Devine, and she has a book that's called It's Okay That You're Not Okay. And if I could have a favorite grief book, this would be it. I know it's a weird thing to say, but she is a psychotherapist whose partner died very unexpectedly. So she's been sort of forced into this process. But some of the things that she recommends that I think are really helpful in terms of self-care for grief, a big one being safety. If you find yourself driving down the road and a song comes on and you are crying and you need to be safe, if you need to pull off the road, you need to, get to a place where you're safe, because even in those moments when you're not necessarily thinking about yourself, if you can't be safe for yourself, be safe for somebody else. And so safety is a big thing. Movement, I think we've talked about this, doing some yoga, going for a walk, just getting movement. Getting outside is a big thing, which can be hard during certain times of the year. Tending to something, sort of like what Sharon was saying, and going from room to room and organizing and, tending to something, gardening, doing something that feels like you are doing something. Shower, make your bed, brush your teeth. These little things can be really helpful accomplishments. Eating during grief is really important, because for a lot of people, for some people they eat too much, for some people they don't eat enough, and not being properly nourished during grief can have long-term effects on your body. And so really try that as best you can to eat and eat well, and to take care of yourself in that way. Coffee and cupcakes for 5 months, they're going to have an effect on you down the road. So just really, and that's where, like, somebody says, what can I cook for you? Well, can you cook me something that's healthy? Don't turn the anger that you might experience towards yourself. Anger is a normal response to grief and will come and go with different things that unfold over the grieving process. But you have the right to be angry. Just try not to turn it on yourself. And then say yes and say no when you need to. There are going to be times when you're grieving where you thought you could be at a certain place at a certain time, and you got to turn around and walk right out. This obviously applies more to non-COVID times, but like, you think you can go to that holiday gathering with your family, and you get in the car and you go, and then you walk in the door and you're like, oh, heck no. Turn around and leave. Do the things, take care of yourself. You're grieving. You've experienced the worst thing in the world. You are not always going to know what you need until that moment happens.
Thank you. We're coming up on the end of our time. Does anybody have any thoughts that you'd like to leave folks with? Some additional advice or anything?
I would just like to leave one thought, and that is, if you see someone that you think is just really stuck in the grief cycle, is to normalize the thought of therapy, is to talk with them about counseling and talk with them about therapy. And I know we can't volunteer or offer to go, to a grief support group with them, but we might be able to give them, some online grief support or some resources or some books, but to recognize that in people and to normalize the need for therapy and not make it some scary thought for people if they need it, because we're going to have a lot of people that need therapy after this pandemic.
Good point.
And thanks for having me.
Well, thank you for being here. Tereesa, did you have anything else that you wanted to add for the
I think
audience?
so.
Well,
I think
thank you.
that, do what's going to be best for you. Remember and have those conversations. I think that's probably up there number one for me. Talk to people about what you need to do and where you're at.
Thank you. Dana, do you have anything else you'd like to add?
Yeah, just sort of to piggyback on what Sharon was saying, to normalize their experience. Grief is not something to be fixed. And wherever somebody is with whatever grief, death, loss of something, loss of time, loss of, life during COVID, it's all normal. And we need to make sure that we support and acknowledge people where they are, because if we don't, it complicates it more because they think they're doing it wrong. So just support them wherever they are.
Well, thank you all so very much for being here for this panel. I know that our audience has taken a lot away from this, and I personally am really grateful for your insight and your experience and your advice. And enjoy the rest of the day and good luck with everything. Thank you so much. We're going to end our recording now.